On a quiet summer night in July 1981, 35-year-old Cheri Domingo invited her friend Gregory Sanchez to help her pack for a move from her Goleta home. They shared dinner, talked about new beginnings, and settled in for what they thought would be a peaceful night. But darkness had been watching. Before dawn, an intruder slipped through a cut screen and shattered their dreams forever. The brutal double murder stunned the small California community and launched a decades-long hunt for a phantom killer. Detectives collected evidence, followed leads, and watched hope fade as years turned into decades. Then, in 2018, revolutionary DNA science finally revealed the shocking truth. The monster who had terrorized California for years was hiding in plain sight, a former police officer living quietly among the very people he had terrorized. But how many other victims were there, and why did it take nearly 40 years to catch him? Before we get into the story, drop a comment with your country and the time right now. The evening air in Goleta carried the scent of jasmine and the distant sound of waves crashing against the California coast. July 26, 1981, felt like any other summer evening in this quiet suburb of Santa Barbara. Children rode their bicycles through tree-lined streets while mothers called them home for dinner. The warm California sun was beginning its descent toward the Pacific Ocean, painting the sky in gentle shades of orange and pink. Cheri Domingo moved through her small home on Toltec Way with the practiced efficiency of someone preparing for a major life change. At 35, she radiated a quiet warmth that drew people to her like moths to a flame. Her artistic hands had created beauty in every corner of the modest house. Watercolor paintings adorned the walls, handmade pottery sat carefully arranged on shelves, and fresh flowers from her garden brightened every room. Each item told a story of a woman who found joy in creating beauty from ordinary things. The living room bore evidence of the upheaval that moving brings. Cardboard boxes sat half-packed on the coffee table, their contents a mixture of memories and practical necessities. Photo albums lay open, revealing snapshots of happier times. Cheri with her teenage daughter Debbie at various stages of growth, family gatherings, quiet moments captured in time. Each photograph represented a piece of a life being carefully dismantled and prepared for reassembly elsewhere. "Are you sure you don't want help with the heavy stuff?" Gregory Sanchez called from the kitchen, his voice carrying the easy confidence of a 27-year-old who stayed in shape through honest work. Greg had arrived earlier that evening, answering Cheri's call for help with packing. Their relationship had evolved over time, from romance to something deeper and more enduring, a friendship built on mutual respect, shared experiences, and genuine care for each other's well-being. Cheri smiled, brushing a strand of hair from her face with the back of her hand. Her fingers bore traces of paint from an art project she had been working on earlier in the day. "I've got it. Besides, you're already doing enough, just being here." She paused at a framed photo of her teenage daughter, Debbie, and her heart tightened with the complex emotions that single motherhood brings: love, worry, hope, and the constant desire to provide a better future. The move represented more than just a change of address. It was a symbol of starting over, of building something new after difficult times. Cheri had spent months planning this transition, carefully considering every aspect of how the change would affect not just her own life, but her daughter's future as well. The new place offered more space, better schools for Debbie, and the promise of fresh beginnings in a community where the past couldn't follow. They worked together as darkness settled over the Benest neighborhood like a comfortable blanket. Streetlights flickered on one by one, casting long shadows between the modest homes that lined Toltec Way. Goleta felt safe in 1981. The kind of place where people left doors unlocked during the day, where children played outside until their mothers called them home for dinner, where neighbors knew each other's names and watched out for each other's families. The work of packing was both tedious and emotional. Every item that went into a box carried memories: a vase that had been a gift from Debbie, artwork created during happier times, books that had provided comfort during lonely evenings. Cheri handled each piece with care, wrapping fragile items in newspaper and tissue paper, creating neat piles of things to keep, donate, or discard. Around 10 o'clock, hunger finally drove them to take a break. They ordered Chinese takeout from a local restaurant that Cheri had frequented for years, spreading the white containers across her kitchen table like a feast. The conversation flowed easily between them, punctuated by comfortable silences and genuine laughter. They talked about Cheri's plans for the new place, how she would set up her art studio, where Debbie's room would be located, the garden she hoped to plant in the spring. Greg shared his own hopes for the future, a promotion at work that seemed within reach, his dreams of eventually starting his own business, the simple pleasures he found in helping friends like Cheri navigate life's challenges. Their conversation had the easy rhythm of people who had known each other for years, who could communicate as much through silence as through words. Neither of them noticed the figure watching from the darkness beyond the sliding glass door. The intruder had been there for some time, studying their movements, learning their routines, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. He moved with the patience of a predator, understanding that timing was everything in the dark work he had come to do. As midnight approached, exhaustion finally began to weigh on both of them. The physical work of packing, combined with the emotional toll of preparing to leave a place filled with memories, had drained their energy. Greg settled onto the couch with a blanket that Cheri had knitted herself, the soft wool carrying the faint scent of her perfume and the comfortable familiarity of home. Cheri headed to her bedroom, pausing in the doorway to look back at Greg. "Thank you," she said simply, but the words carried the weight of genuine gratitude for his friendship, his help, and his presence during a difficult time. "I don't know what I would have done without you today." The house grew quiet, except for the gentle hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of traffic on the nearby highway. The sliding door remained slightly ajar to catch the cool night breeze, a decision that would haunt investigators for decades to come. It was such a small thing, leaving a door unlocked in a neighborhood that felt safe, but it would prove to be the entry point for unimaginable evil. At 3 o'clock in the morning, when the world was at its quietest and most vulnerable, darkness took human form. The intruder had been watching, learning, waiting for this moment when the house's occupants would be in their deepest sleep. He moved with practiced silence, his footsteps muffled by the soft grass of the backyard, his movements calculated and precise. The cut in the window screen was methodical, made with a sharp knife that sliced through the metal mesh without creating the rough tears that might have suggested a hurried or amateur entry. This was the work of someone who had done this before. Someone who understood the importance of stealth and preparation. The intruder had studied the house's layout, noted the positions of windows and doors, identified potential escape routes. Greg's eyes snapped open at the first sound, a whisper of movement that didn't belong in the familiar nighttime symphony of the house. His athletic instincts, honed by years of physical activity and an innate protective nature, kicked in immediately. His muscles tensed as he tried to locate the source of the disturbance, his mind racing to process what his ears had detected. In the dim light filtering through the windows from the street lamps outside, he saw a shadow that shouldn't exist, a human silhouette moving through the living room with purpose and malice. The realization that an intruder had entered the house sent adrenaline coursing through his system, sharpening his senses and preparing his body for confrontation. "Who's there?" Greg's voice cut through the silence, strong despite the fear rising in his chest. He rose from the couch, positioning himself between the intruder and the hallway that led to Cheri's bedroom. Even in his terror, his first instinct was to protect, to shield the woman he cared about from whatever danger had entered their sanctuary. The confrontation that followed was swift and brutal. Greg fought with everything he had, his protective nature driving him to resist even against overwhelming odds. He lunged at the intruder, grappling for control of the weapon he could see gleaming in the dim light. The two men crashed into furniture, sending lamps and picture frames crashing to the floor. In a cacophony of breaking glass and splintering wood, the intruder was prepared for resistance. He had encountered brave victims before, people who fought back against his invasion of their most private spaces. But he was armed, trained, and utterly without mercy. The struggle was violent but brief, ending with the sound of gunfire that shattered the peaceful night like thunder rolling across the Santa Barbara hills. When the shots rang out, Cheri awoke in terror, her mind struggling to process the sounds of violence erupting in her home. She called out for Greg, her voice filled with panic and confusion, but the intruder had planned for this possibility as well. He moved through the house with the efficiency of someone who had mapped out every step of his attack. What happened next would be reconstructed years later through physical evidence and crime scene analysis. The medical examiner would document the precise nature of the injuries, the trajectory of bullets, the signs of struggle that marked both victims' final moments. But the clinical language of forensic reports could never capture the human horror of what transpired in those final minutes. When silence returned to the house on Toltec Way, it carried the weight of tragedy. 2 lives had been stolen, 2 futures erased by senseless violence. The killer vanished into the darkness as quickly as he had appeared, leaving behind only evidence that would torment investigators for decades to come. Morning arrived with the harsh reality of flashing police lights reflecting off the windows of neighboring homes. A neighbor had noticed Cheri's front door standing open, unusual for someone as careful and security-conscious as she had always been. Mrs. Rodriguez, who lived next door, had developed a friendship with Cheri over the years and knew her routines well enough to recognize that something was wrong. The 911 call came in at 7:23 a.m., "I think something's happened to my neighbor," Mrs. Rodriguez told the dispatcher, her voice shaking with worry. "Her front door is wide open, and her car is still in the driveway. She was supposed to start packing today, but something doesn't feel right." The first patrol officers arrived at 7:31 a.m., their black and white police cruisers pulling up to the modest home with sirens wailing through streets where children should have been preparing for another day of summer vacation. Officer Michael Chen approached the open front door cautiously, his hand resting on his service weapon as he called out for the occupants. The scene that greeted him inside would be burned into his memory for the rest of his career. The living room showed clear signs of a violent struggle: overturned furniture, broken glass, blood spatter on the walls that told a story of desperate resistance and ultimate tragedy. Chen immediately radioed for backup and a supervisor, recognizing that this was far beyond a routine call. Detective Larry Poole arrived within minutes of the first responders. A 20-year veteran of the Santa Barbara County Sheriff's Office, he had seen enough crime scenes to steel himself against the worst that humanity could offer. But nothing in his experience had prepared him for the level of brutality that greeted him inside Cheri's home. Poole was a methodical investigator, known throughout the department for his attention to detail and his unwavering commitment to seeking justice for victims. He had grown up in a working-class family where right and wrong were clearly defined concepts, and he brought that moral clarity to his work every day. As he surveyed the crime scene, his trained eye began cataloging details that would prove crucial in the investigation to come. The scene told a story of violence and extraordinary courage. Greg had fought hard, evident from the overturned furniture, defensive wounds on his hands and arms, and the blood evidence that showed he had managed to wound his attacker. Cheri had been targeted with calculated cruelty, but even in her final moments, she had shown remarkable bravery. The killer had taken time with his work, suggesting this wasn't a random burglary gone wrong or a crime of passion. "Secure the perimeter," Poole ordered, his voice steady despite the anger building in his chest. "Nobody goes in or out without my say-so. And get the crime scene unit here immediately. We're going to need every expert we can get." He knelt beside the victims, seeing them not as evidence but as people whose lives had been cut short. Someone's mother, someone's friend, someone's hope for tomorrow. The crime scene. Photographers' flash illuminated details that would haunt the investigation for years to come. Shoe prints in the soft earth outside the window showed the killer's approach route. Fibers caught on the torn screen would be analyzed and cataloged. A single drop of blood that didn't belong to either victim was carefully collected with sterile swabs. Each piece of evidence was cataloged with the precision of scientists and the desperation of humans seeking justice. Dr. Patricia Williams, the county's chief medical examiner, arrived at noon to begin her preliminary examination of the victims. A soft-spoken woman with steel-gray hair and gentle hands, she treated each victim with the dignity and respect they deserved. Her initial assessment confirmed what Poole had suspected. This was the work of someone with experience in violence, someone who had killed before. "The wounds are precise, Doctor," Williams explained to Poole as they stood in the hallway outside the living room. "This isn't random violence. The killer knew exactly what he was doing. The pattern of injuries suggests he may have had some kind of training, military perhaps, or law enforcement." The words sent a chill through Poole's chest. The idea that the killer might be someone sworn to protect and serve made the crime even more heinous, but it was a lead that would prove prophetic decades later. By afternoon, news vans lined Toltec Way like mechanical vultures drawn to tragedy. Reporters spoke in hushed tones about the brutal double murder that had shattered Goleta's sense of security. The story led every local newscast, with anchors struggling to find words adequate to describe the violence that had invaded this quiet suburban neighborhood. Neighbors gathered in small groups on sidewalks and front lawns, their faces marked by shock and growing fear. The comfortable assumption that their community was safe from the kind of violence they saw on television had been shattered as completely as the glass scattered across Cheri's living room floor. "I heard gunshots," admitted Mrs. Martinez, who lived 3 houses down from Cheri. She was an elderly woman who had watched the neighborhood change over the years, but had always felt secure in her modest home. "But you know how it is around here. Sometimes it's just kids with firecrackers, or backfiring cars. I never thought. I should have called the police right away." Her guilt was palpable, and Poole made a point of speaking with her personally. "You couldn't have known," he assured her, though he could see the weight of regret in her eyes. "This isn't your fault. The only person responsible for this is the one who committed these crimes." Detective Poole worked 18-hour days in the weeks that followed, following every lead no matter how thin or unlikely it seemed. He interviewed neighbors, friends, co-workers, anyone who had crossed paths with Cheri or Greg in the days and weeks before their deaths. He visited Cheri's workplace, a local art supply store where she had worked part-time, and spoke with her customers and colleagues. The picture that emerged was of two people who had no enemies, no debts, no reason for someone to want them dead. Cheri was universally described as kind, generous, and artistic. Customers at the art store spoke of how she would spend extra time helping them with projects, offering advice and encouragement with genuine enthusiasm. Greg was remembered as hardworking, loyal, and protective of those he cared about. They were good people, Cheri's supervisor at the art store told Poole through tears. Cheri always lit up the room when she came to work. She had this way of making everyone feel special, like their art projects were the most important thing in the world. Who could possibly want to hurt someone like that? The question haunted Poole because there seemed to be no rational answer. This wasn't personal. It was something far more frightening than a targeted attack. It suggested a predator who chose victims based on opportunity, rather than any personal connection. The first break came from ballistics analysis conducted at the state crime lab in Sacramento. The .45 caliber weapon used in the murders had left distinctive markings on the bullet casings and projectiles. When the ballistics report came back, it contained information that sent chills through the investigative team. The same weapon had been used in another double murder just months earlier in Ventura County. "He's escalating," Poole told his partner, Detective James Sullivan, as they studied crime scene photos spread across their desk in the sheriff's office. The photos showed similar patterns of violence, similar methods of entry, similar targeting of couples in their homes. "Look at the pattern. He's getting bolder, more violent. This won't be the last." Sullivan, a veteran investigator with nearly as much experience as Poole, nodded grimly. "We need to contact every law enforcement agency in Southern California. If this guy is moving between jurisdictions, we need to coordinate our efforts. This is bigger than just our case now." Fear spread through Santa Barbara County like wildfire in the dry California hills. The news that a serial killer might be operating in the area triggered a wave of panic buying at local hardware stores. Home security systems, deadbolts, window locks, and motion sensor lights flew off the shelves as residents tried to fortify their homes against an invisible threat. Dog adoption centers emptied as families sought four-legged protection for their homes. German Shepherds, Dobermans, and Rottweilers were in particular demand, with some families adopting multiple dogs to create an early warning system against intruders. Pet stores reported a surge in sales of dog food, leashes, and training equipment. Children who had once played freely in front yards until dark were called inside before sunset. Parents who had never worried about their teenagers walking to friends' houses now insisted on driving them everywhere. The simple pleasures of small-town life, evening walks, open windows, unlocked doors, became casualties of fear. The killer had done more than murder two innocent people. He had murdered the peace of mind of an entire community. Every creak in the night, every shadow at the window, every unexplained sound became potential terror. Marriages strained under the pressure of constant vigilance. Families slept fitfully, awakening at every sound. Mrs. Chen, who lived 2 blocks from the crime scene, installed floodlights around her property that turned night into day. "I know it bothers the neighbors," she told a reporter from the local newspaper, "but I'm not taking any chances. If someone tries to break into my house, they're going to be lit up like a Christmas tree." The psychological impact extended far beyond Goleta. News coverage of the murders reached throughout California, triggering reports of similar crimes in other jurisdictions. Detectives from Ventura, Orange, Sacramento, and Contra Costa counties began comparing notes, looking for patterns that might connect their unsolved cases. Debbie Domingo McMullen was 17 when she lost her mother, a junior in high school, who had been looking forward to her senior year and graduation. The teenager who had been making plans for college and dreaming about her future suddenly faced a world where safety was an illusion and evil wore a human face that no one could identify. The grief was crushing, a weight that seemed impossible to bear. Debbie found herself unable to concentrate in school, unable to sleep through the night, unable to feel safe anywhere. The simple act of walking into her mother's house, now a crime scene, became an ordeal that required tremendous courage. But even in her darkest moments, Debbie held on to something her mother had taught her through years of single parenthood and artistic struggle: that love was stronger than fear, that truth would eventually triumph over lies, and that good people had a responsibility to stand up against evil, even when the odds seemed overwhelming. The funeral service was held at St. Mark's Catholic Church, a modest building that had served the Goleta community for decades. Hundreds of people filled the pews to honor Cheri's memory, creating a sea of flowers and tears that testified to the impact she had made on her community. They spoke of her kindness, her creativity, her infectious laugh that could brighten even the darkest days. Father Martinez, who had known Cheri since she was a young mother struggling to make ends meet, delivered a eulogy that captured her spirit. "Cheri saw beauty in everything," he said, his voice carrying across the packed church. "She could take a handful of clay and make something wonderful. She could take a blank canvas and fill it with color and life. Most importantly, she could take a moment of someone's day and make it better just by being herself." Greg was remembered as a protector, a man who had fought to his last breath to defend someone he cared about. His friends from work spoke of his loyalty, his willingness to help anyone in need, his quiet strength that made others feel safe. The service ended with a promise from Detective Poole, who stood before the congregation with tears in his eyes. "We will find who did this. However long it takes, we will not rest until justice is served." Months turned into years, and years stretched into decades. The investigation expanded as similar crimes surfaced across California, creating a web of violence that seemed to have no beginning and no end. The killer had a type, a method, a signature that became chillingly familiar to law enforcement officers throughout the state. He targeted couples in quiet neighborhoods, striking when victims felt most secure in their own homes. He was careful, intelligent, and seemingly invisible, leaving behind just enough evidence to taunt investigators but never enough to identify him. Crime scene analysts began to recognize his work even before DNA testing could confirm the connections. Detective Poole worked the case with the intensity of a man possessed. He covered his office walls with maps, photographs, and timelines, creating a visual representation of the killer's activities that visitors found both fascinating and disturbing. He studied victimology, looking for patterns in the killer's target selection. He analyzed geographic data, trying to predict where the next attack might occur. The stress of the investigation took its toll on Poole's personal life. His marriage strained under the pressure of 18-hour workdays and a husband who brought the darkness of his work home with him every night. He developed insomnia, lying awake in bed thinking about evidence and wondering what clue he might have missed. "You can't save everyone," his wife, Carol, told him one evening as they sat in their kitchen, barely speaking to each other over dinner. "You're destroying yourself, and you're destroying us. These people are already dead, Larry. You can't bring them back." But Poole couldn't let go. Every time he looked at the crime scene photos, he saw not just evidence, but human beings whose lives had been cut short. He felt the weight of promises made to grieving families, the responsibility of being their only hope for justice in a world that seemed increasingly unfair. Poole retired in 1995, but not before training a new generation of detectives to carry on the hunt. The ceremony was bittersweet, marked by the knowledge that he was leaving with the case unsolved. He handed over boxes of evidence to his replacement, Detective Maria Santos, with the weight of unfulfilled promises heavy on his shoulders. "These people deserve justice," he told Santos, his voice thick with emotion. "Don't let them be forgotten. Don't let this case get buried under new investigations and budget cuts. Someone, somewhere, knows who did this. We just have to keep looking until we find them." Santos, a 15-year veteran with a reputation for tenacity, accepted the files with the solemnity of someone receiving a sacred trust. She had worked with Poole for 3 years, learning his methods and sharing his passion for seeking justice. She understood that she wasn't just taking over a case. She was inheriting a mission. The case files moved from active investigation to cold case storage, but they were never forgotten. Evidence boxes were carefully maintained in climate-controlled rooms, waiting for science to catch up with determination. DNA testing was still in its infancy in the 1990s, but forward-thinking investigators preserved every sample, every fiber, every microscopic clue that might someday point toward truth. The year 2001 brought the first real breakthrough in 20 years. DNA technology had advanced enough to extract usable profiles from the degraded evidence collected at Toltec Way and other crime scenes. The California Department of Justice had established a state-of-the-art DNA laboratory, and cold case evidence was finally getting the scientific attention it deserved. The results that came back from the lab sent shockwaves through law enforcement agencies across the state. The killer's DNA was present at multiple crime scenes spanning from Ventura County to Sacramento, confirming what investigators had long suspected. They were dealing with one of the most prolific serial offenders in California history. Detective Paul Holes, a forensic investigator with the Contra Costa County District Attorney's Office, became obsessed with the case after reviewing the DNA results. A methodical man with a background in biochemistry, Holes brought scientific rigor to the investigation that complemented the intuitive detective work of officers like Poole and Santos. Holes spent months in evidence rooms, re-examining physical evidence with new technology and fresh eyes. He digitized crime scene photos, creating databases that allowed for easy comparison between cases. He worked with geographic profilers to map the killer's movements, looking for patterns that might reveal where he lived or worked. This isn't just a killer, Holes explained to a room full of investigators from multiple jurisdictions during a coordination meeting in Sacramento. This is possibly the most prolific serial offender in California history. He was active for over a decade, maybe longer. He committed dozens of rapes, at least 13 murders, and countless burglaries. And he's been hiding in plain sight ever since. The scope of the crimes was staggering. The killer had operated across multiple counties, adapting his methods as law enforcement techniques evolved. In his early years, he was primarily a rapist, attacking single women in their homes with a level of preparation and violence that terrorized entire communities. Later, he began targeting couples, escalating to murder when victims resisted or could identify him. The killer was given various names by the press and law enforcement as different agencies worked their cases. The East Area Rapist for his early crimes in Sacramento, the original Night Stalker for his later murders in Southern California, and eventually, the Golden State Killer as the scope of his crimes became clear. Each name represented a different phase of his criminal career, but the DNA proved they were all the same man. Despite the breakthrough in linking the crimes, the identity of the killer remained a mystery. The DNA profile was entered into every national database, compared against samples from known offenders, and cross-referenced with evidence from unsolved crimes across the country. But no match was found. The investigation generated thousands of tips from the public. Citizens reported suspicious neighbors, ex-husbands with violent tendencies, and strangers who had behaved oddly decades earlier. Each tip was investigated thoroughly, leading to countless interviews and DNA comparisons. Some tips led to the solving of other unrelated crimes, but none brought investigators any closer to identifying the Golden State Killer. Cheri Domingo McMullen had grown into a strong woman, shaped by tragedy but not defined by it. She married a supportive man who understood her need to seek justice for her mother. She raised children of her own, teaching them about their grandmother's love and creativity while protecting them from the darker details of how she died. But Debbie never forgot her mother or stopped believing that justice would eventually come. She followed the investigation closely, maintaining relationships with detectives and staying informed about new developments in forensic science. She read every book written about the case, watched every documentary, and attended conferences for victims' families. In 2010, Debbie began speaking publicly about the case, attending conferences for victims' families, and advocating for cold case investigation. Her voice was steady, her message clear. These crimes don't have expiration dates. Every victim deserves justice, no matter how much time has passed. We can't bring our loved ones back, but we can make sure their killers are held accountable. Her courage in speaking publicly about her mother's murder inspired other families to come forward, to demand answers, to keep pressure on law enforcement agencies to prioritize cold cases. The Golden State Killer cases gained national attention through books, documentaries, and podcasts that brought the crimes to a new generation of amateur investigators and armchair detectives. The public became invested in finding answers in a way that was unprecedented in criminal investigations. Online forums devoted to the case attracted thousands of participants who analyzed evidence, compared timelines, and generated new theories about the killer's identity. Some of their work was helpful, much of it was not, but the sustained attention kept the case alive in public consciousness. Meanwhile, a revolutionary new tool was emerging in forensic science: genetic genealogy. Investigators could now use DNA evidence to build family trees, tracing genetic connections through public databases to identify potential suspects. The technique had been used successfully in a few high-profile cases, proving that even decades-old DNA could lead to modern justice. Genetic genealogy worked by comparing crime scene DNA to genetic profiles in public databases like GEDeadmatch, where people uploaded their DNA results from commercial testing companies to search for relatives. If investigators could find even distant relatives of the perpetrator, they could build family trees working backward through generations and then forward to identify potential suspects. The process was painstaking and required expertise in both genetics and genealogy. Investigators had to understand how DNA inheritance worked, how to read genetic charts, and how to navigate complex family relationships. They also had to work within legal constraints, ensuring that their methods would produce evidence admissible in court. By 2018, a team of investigators and genealogists had been working for months to trace the Golden State Killer's DNA through family connections. The team included Paul Holes, FBI analysts, genetic genealogists from private companies, and prosecutors from multiple jurisdictions who would eventually need to bring the case to trial. The process began with uploading the killer's DNA profile to GeneMatch under an assumed name, creating a genetic profile that could be compared to thousands of others in the database. The initial results showed several potential relatives, but all were distant connections that would require extensive family tree research to trace back to a common ancestor. Barbara Ray Venter, a genetic genealogist who had solved other high-profile cold cases, led the genealogical research. Working with limited information and incomplete family records, she began building massive family trees that extended back through multiple generations, looking for patterns that might lead to the killer's identity. The work was complicated by adoptions, name changes, illegitimate children, and incomplete records. Some family lines dead-ended when immigrants had changed their names upon entering the United States. Others became confused when families moved frequently or when official records were lost or destroyed. But slowly, methodically, the family trees began to take shape. Ray Venter identified several branches of families that could have produced the killer based on the genetic evidence. Each branch required detailed research into births, deaths, marriages, and movements of family members over multiple generations. The breakthrough came on a Tuesday morning in April when the family tree research finally led to a specific individual, Joseph James DeAngelo, a 72-year-old former police officer living quietly in Citrus Heights, California. The genealogical work indicated that he was a strong candidate based on his genetic relationship to the samples in the database. But genetic genealogy could only point investigators in the right direction. They still needed to obtain a direct DNA sample from DeAngelo to confirm that he was indeed the Golden State Killer. This required surveillance, legal authority, and careful planning to avoid alerting their suspect. The revelation that their prime suspect was a former police officer sent shockwaves through the investigative team. It explains so much about the killer's methods, his knowledge of police procedures, his ability to evade capture, his understanding of forensic techniques. The man who had terrorized California for over a decade had been hiding behind a badge. DeAngelo had worked for the Exeter Police Department and later the Auburn Police Department during the years when many of the crimes were committed. His law enforcement background had given him training in surveillance, crime scene analysis, and the very investigative techniques that were being used to hunt him. Surveillance began immediately, with investigators from multiple agencies taking shifts to watch DeAngelo's suburban home. They noted his daily routines, trips to the grocery store, visits to hobby shops, walks around his neighborhood. He appeared to be a typical retiree, blending seamlessly into his community. The surveillance team followed DeAngelo to restaurants, hoping to collect utensils or napkins that might contain his DNA. They watched him shop for groceries and followed him to a hobby shop where he bought model airplanes and supplies. Each discarded item was carefully collected and sent to the lab for testing. The DNA comparison took 48 hours that seemed like 48 years to the investigators waiting for results. The lab technicians understood the importance of their work and took extraordinary care to avoid contamination or error. Multiple tests were run to ensure accuracy. When the results came back, there was no doubt. Joseph James DeAngelo was the Golden State Killer. The DNA match was conclusive, linking him to crimes spanning decades and multiple jurisdictions. The man who had haunted California's nightmares for 40 years had finally been identified. The arrest plan was elaborate, involving dozens of law enforcement officers from multiple agencies. They couldn't risk DeAngelo escaping or destroying evidence, and they had to consider the possibility that he might be armed and dangerous despite his age. The arrest was scheduled for early morning, when he would be least likely to resist. On April 24, 2018, just before dawn, dozens of law enforcement officers surrounded DeAngelo's home in Citrus Heights. The neighborhood was quietly evacuated to ensure civilian safety. Armored vehicles positioned themselves at strategic locations, while sharpshooters took positions with clear views of the house. The arrest was swift and anticlimactic. D'Angelo emerged from his house to retrieve his newspaper, a routine he had followed for years. As he bent to pick up the paper, officers moved in from all directions, surrounding him before he could react. "Joseph James D'Angelo, you're under arrest," Detective Holes announced as handcuffs clicked around the suspect's wrists. The man who had terrorized an entire state for decades appeared frail and confused, asking repeatedly what he was being arrested for. He seemed genuinely surprised, as if he had believed his crimes were so far in the past that he was safe from prosecution. As he was led to a patrol car, an era of terror finally came to an end. The news broke like a thunderclap across the nation. The Golden State Killer had been caught. Social media exploded, with reactions ranging from relief to disbelief. News outlets scrambled to cover the story, with reporters struggling to convey the magnitude of finally solving one of America's most notorious cold cases. For investigators who had worked the case for decades, the arrest brought a complex mix of emotions. There was satisfaction in finally identifying the killer, but also sadness for all the victims who had died without seeing justice. Paul Holes, who had devoted years of his life to the case, found himself crying in his car outside the arrest scene. "I never thought I'd live to see this day," Detective Larry Poole told a reporter from his retirement home in Oregon. At 81, the former investigator had followed every development in the case, never losing hope that science would eventually catch up with determination. "Those families waited so long for answers. I just wish more of them could have lived to see this." For the families of victims, the arrest brought a complex mix of emotions that was difficult to articulate. Joy that justice was finally within reach. Anger that it had taken so long. Grief for all the years lost to uncertainty and fear. Many family members had died without knowing the truth, taking their questions to the grave. Debbie Domingo McMullen was at work when her phone rang with the news. She sat in her car in the parking lot outside her office and cried, for her mother, for Greg, for all the families who had waited so long for this moment. Then she spent the rest of the day calling reporters, making sure the world knew that Cheri Domingo and Gregory Sanchez had not been forgotten. The man who had haunted California's nightmares for decades was revealed to be disturbingly ordinary. Joseph James D'Angelo was a former police officer, a husband, a father, a neighbor who waved hello and complained about property taxes. He had attended neighborhood barbecues, coached youth sports, and maintained a facade of normalcy while harboring one of the darkest secrets in criminal history. The revelation that the Golden State Killer had been a law enforcement officer raised uncomfortable questions about background checks, psychological screening, and the potential for evil to hide behind a badge. Police departments across the country began reviewing their hiring practices and employee monitoring systems. D'Angelo's family expressed shock and disbelief. His ex-wife told investigators that she had suspected him of being unfaithful during their marriage, but never of being a killer. His daughters struggled to reconcile the father they had known with the monster described in news reports. As the case moved toward trial, prosecutor Anne-Marie Schubert faced the unprecedented challenge of bringing justice across multiple jurisdictions for crimes spanning decades. As the elected district attorney of Sacramento County, Schubert had experience with complex cases, but nothing had prepared her for the scope of the Golden State Killer prosecution. The logistical challenges were enormous. Evidence was scattered across multiple crime labs and storage facilities. Witnesses were elderly or deceased. Crime scenes had been altered or destroyed over the decades. Some victims' families wanted the death penalty. Others preferred life in prison to avoid years of appeals and court proceedings. Schubert assembled a team of prosecutors, investigators, and support staff to handle the massive case. They worked with district attorneys from other counties to coordinate charges and ensure that all victims would be represented. The goal was to achieve justice while avoiding the decades of appeals that often accompany death penalty cases. D'Angelo's defense team, led by public defender Diane Howard, faced the impossible task of defending a client whose DNA had linked him conclusively to multiple murders. Their strategy focused on avoiding the death penalty rather than proving innocence, hoping to negotiate a plea agreement that would spare their client's life. The negotiations were complex and emotionally charged. Victims' families were consulted extensively about their preferences for punishment. Some wanted D'Angelo to face the ultimate penalty for his crimes. Others, exhausted by decades of grief and uncertainty, simply wanted the certainty that he would never be released from prison. During the pre-trial proceedings, more details about D'Angelo's crimes emerged. Investigators had linked him to more than 50 rapes, 13 murders, and over 100 burglaries. The full scope of his criminal career was staggering, spanning from 1973 to 1986 and affecting countless victims and their families. The case also revealed the importance of DNA evidence preservation and the potential of genetic genealogy to solve cold cases. Law enforcement agencies across the country began reviewing their evidence storage practices and investing in new technologies that might help solve other decades-old crimes. In June 2020, Joseph James DeAngelo stood before Sacramento County Superior Court, Judge Michael Bowman, and pleaded guilty to 13 murders, including those of Cheri Domingo and Gregory Sanchez. His voice was barely audible as he uttered the word guilty again and again, finally admitting to crimes that had terrorized California for over a decade. The courtroom was filled with family members, some now elderly, who had waited 40 years for this moment. Reporters filled the gallery, documenting the end of one of the most notorious criminal cases in American history. Outside, COVID-19 restrictions limited attendance, but the moment was broadcast live to a nation hungry for justice. The sentencing phase of the trial provided an opportunity for victims' families to address DeAngelo directly, to tell him about the devastation his crimes had caused and the strength they had found in survival. Victim impact statements were read over several days, painting a comprehensive picture of the ripple effects of violence on families and communities. When Debbie Domingo McMullen stood to address the court, her voice was strong and clear despite the emotion of the moment. She had waited nearly 40 years for this opportunity to speak directly to her mother's killer, and she was determined to make her words count. "You took my mother from me when I was just 17 years old," she said, looking directly at DeAngelo, who sat slumped in his chair, avoiding eye contact. "You stole her future, her dreams, her chance to see me graduate from high school, get married, have children. You robbed my children of their grandmother, and you took away the safety and innocence of our entire community." She spoke of her mother's love of art, her kindness to strangers, her dreams for the future that had been stolen on that July night in 1981. She talked about Greg's courage, his loyalty, his willingness to protect others, even at the cost of his own life. Her words painted pictures of two vibrant human beings whose lives had been cut short by senseless violence. "But you didn't win," Debbie continued, her voice growing stronger. "Love wins. Truth wins, justice wins. My mother's memory lives on in every painting she created, every life she touched, every moment of beauty she brought into this world. You tried to destroy that, but you failed. We are here today because good people never stop searching for the truth." The courtroom was silent except for the sound of quiet weeping. Even seasoned court reporters wiped tears from their eyes as they transcribed her words. Judge Bowman paused to collect himself before proceeding with the sentencing. Other family members spoke of loved ones who had died without answers, of children who grew up in fear, of communities that had never fully healed. They described the long nights of wondering, the false hopes raised by promising leads that led nowhere, the strength they had found in supporting each other through decades of uncertainty. Margaret Wardlow, whose son Keith was murdered by DeAngelo in 1981, spoke with the weight of nearly 4 decades of grief. "I never thought I would live to see this day," she said, her voice shaking with emotion. "I'm 86 years old, and I've spent more than half my life wondering who killed my son. Today, I finally have my answer." On August 21, 2020, Joseph James DeAngelo was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Judge Bowman's words were measured and solemn as he imposed the sentence that would ensure DeAngelo would never again be free to harm innocent people. "The scope of these crimes is simply staggering," Judge Bowman said as he addressed the packed courtroom. "The defendant committed acts of almost incomprehensible evil over a period of many years. The pain and trauma he inflicted extends far beyond his direct victims to include family members, friends, and entire communities that lived in fear." As the gavel fell, 40 years of uncertainty came to an end. The monster was caged, and the families could finally begin the long process of healing. DeAngelo was led away in shackles, his head down, avoiding the eyes of the families whose lives he had shattered decades earlier. Outside the courthouse, Debbie Domingo McMullen spoke to a crowd of reporters and supporters. "This day has been a long time coming," she said, squinting in the bright California sunshine. "Justice delayed is not justice denied. My mother and Greg can finally rest in peace, knowing that their killer will never hurt anyone else." The sentencing marked the end of one of the longest and most complex criminal investigations in American history. But for the families involved, it was also the beginning of a new chapter, one focused on healing, remembrance, and ensuring that the victims would be remembered for their lives, not just their deaths. In the months following the sentencing, communities across California held memorials for the victims of the Golden State Killer. These gatherings served multiple purposes: honoring the dead, celebrating the resolution of the case, and beginning the collective healing process that had been postponed for decades. In Goleta, residents gathered at Gersh Park for a memorial service that drew hundreds of people. The crowd included elderly neighbors who remembered Cheri and Greg, young families who had moved to the area after the murders, and law enforcement officers who had worked on the case over the years. Flowers were placed at a memorial bench that had been installed in honor of all victims of violent crime. Children who had grown up with their parents' fears finally understood why their mothers had checked the locks twice every night, and why their fathers had insisted on walking them to school even in broad daylight. The healing was gradual but real. Support groups formed for survivors of violent crime and family members of victims. Cold case detectives across the country used the success of the Golden State Killer investigation to reinvigorate other decades-old investigations, applying new techniques and technologies to cases that had seemed hopeless. Debbie found peace in advocacy work, helping other families navigate the complex world of victim services and criminal justice. She spoke at conferences for crime victims, consulted with law enforcement agencies, developing cold case protocols, and worked to ensure that victims' rights remained a priority even as new crimes demanded attention. "Solving my mother's case doesn't bring her back," Debbie told a conference of victim advocates in San Francisco, "but it shows other families that they shouldn't give up hope. Justice may be delayed, but it's not impossible. Good people working together can overcome even the longest odds." The success of the Golden State Killer case had ripple effects throughout the criminal justice system. The techniques used to identify D'Angelo were applied to hundreds of other cold cases across the country, leading to arrests and convictions in murders that had remained unsolved for decades. The detective work that solved the Golden State Killer case became a model for law enforcement agencies worldwide. Paul Holes, who had become the public face of the investigation, found himself in demand as a speaker and consultant. He published papers on genetic genealogy, trained officers in the revolutionary techniques that had brought justice to so many families, and worked with legislators to establish protocols for using these new tools. The case also sparked important discussions about privacy, DNA databases, and the balance between solving crimes and protecting individual rights. Civil liberties advocates raised concerns about the use of public genealogy databases for law enforcement purposes, while victim advocates argued that the benefits outweighed the privacy concern. These conversations led to new legislation and policies governing the use of genetic genealogy in criminal investigations. Law enforcement agencies developed protocols to ensure that the techniques were used ethically and within constitutional boundaries, while still preserving their effectiveness in solving cold cases. Detective Larry Poole, now in his 80s and living in a retirement community in Oregon, finally felt the weight of an old promise fulfilled. He had carried the burden of the unsolved case for 20 years after his retirement, wondering if justice would ever come for Cheri and Greg. When the news of D'Angelo's arrest reached him, he wept openly for the first time since the day he had viewed their bodies. Poole kept a photo of Cheri and Greg on his desk in his small apartment, a reminder that persistence and faith could overcome even the longest odds. He often spoke to other retired officers about the importance of never giving up on victims, of treating every case as if it were their own family member who had been harmed. "I made a promise to their families," Poole told a documentary filmmaker who interviewed him about the case. "I promised we would find their killer. It took 40 years, but we kept that promise. That's what we owe to every victim, the promise that we'll never stop looking for the truth." Universities across the country began teaching courses on cold case investigation, using the Golden State Killer case as a primary example of how science, determination, and community cooperation could achieve what seemed impossible. Students in criminal justice programs studied the investigative techniques, the use of genetic genealogy, and the importance of evidence preservation. The case became required reading in forensic science courses, with professors using it to illustrate how advances in DNA technology could breathe new life into old investigations. Students learned that every piece of evidence, no matter how small or seemingly insignificant, could potentially hold the key to solving a case decades later. Books were written, documentaries were filmed, and podcasts devoted entire seasons to the case that had captivated the nation. I'll Be Gone in the Dark, by Michelle McNamara, who had died before D'Angelo's arrest, became a bestseller and introduced the case to millions of readers who had never heard of the Golden State Killer. But for the families involved, the media attention was secondary to the simple fact that truth had finally emerged from decades of darkness. They appreciated the public interest in their loved ones' stories, but they were more focused on the practical work of healing and moving forward with their lives. The story of Cheri Domingo and Gregory Sanchez became more than a tale of victimization. It became a testament to the power of love, persistence, and the unshakable human belief that justice will ultimately prevail. Their names were spoken with reverence at victim advocacy conferences, their memories preserved with dignity in the hearts of those who had known them. New cold case units were established in police departments across the country, funded partly by public demand for justice in forgotten cases and partly by grant money made available after the Golden State Killer case demonstrated the potential for solving old crimes. These units were staffed with detectives trained in the latest forensic techniques and given access to cutting-edge technology. The California Department of Justice expanded its DNA laboratory and hired additional genetic genealogists to work on cold cases. Other states followed suit, investing in the technology and training necessary to apply genetic genealogy to their own unsolved crimes. DNA databases expanded as more people submitted samples for genealogical research, inadvertently providing law enforcement with a larger pool of genetic information to work with. Commercial DNA testing companies updated their privacy policies and worked with law enforcement to establish procedures for accessing their databases when legally authorized. Genetic genealogy became standard practice in major police departments, with officers receiving training in the basics of genetics, family tree construction, and the legal requirements for using these techniques. The success rate for solving cold cases using genetic genealogy exceeded even the most optimistic predictions. In 2023, on the 42nd anniversary of the murders, Debbie Domingo McMullen visited the Santa Barbara County Sheriff's Office to thank the investigators who had never given up on her mother's case. She brought cookies she had baked using her mother's recipe, sharing sweetness in a place that had seen so much sorrow over the years. The current sheriff, who had been a young deputy when the murders occurred, personally thanked Debbie for her patience and persistence. "Your mother would be proud of the woman you've become," he told her, his voice thick with emotion. "You've turned tragedy into purpose, and you've helped ensure that other families don't have to wait as long for answers." The evidence room that had once held boxes of unsolved mysteries was now much emptier. The Golden State Killer case had not only solved 13 murders and dozens of rapes, it had provided techniques and hope that solved hundreds of other cases across the country. Cold case investigators made pilgrimages to California to study the methods that had been used, taking what they learned back to their own departments. A new generation of investigators studied the case files, learning how persistence, technology, and community cooperation could overcome even the most challenging obstacles. They understood that every victim mattered, every family deserved answers, and every case was worth solving, no matter how much time had passed. The legacy of Cheri Domingo and Gregory Sanchez lived on in every cold case that was reopened, every family that found closure, and every community that refused to let evil have the final word. Their story had become part of the larger narrative of justice in America. Proof that the arc of the moral universe, though long, does indeed bend toward justice. Detective Maria Santos, who had taken over the case from Larry Poole, finally retired in 2022 with the satisfaction of having seen the case through to its conclusion. At her retirement party, she spoke about the lessons she had learned from working the Golden State Killer case for over 2 decades. "This case taught me that we should never give up on victims," Santos told the gathering of fellow officers. "It taught me that science and determination can overcome any obstacle. Most importantly, it taught me that families like Debbie's deserve our very best efforts, no matter how much time has passed." Today, Joseph James D'Angelo sits in a California state prison, serving multiple life sentences without the possibility of parole. He is old now, frail, a shadow of the predator who once terrorized an entire state. The man who thought he was untouchable discovered that justice has a long memory and an even longer reach. In his prison cell, D'Angelo spends his days much like any other elderly inmate, sleeping, eating bland food, watching television when allowed, and waiting for his life to end. He receives no visitors, writes no letters, and shows no remorse for the lives he destroyed. His anonymity in prison is complete. Even his fellow inmates largely ignore him. Prison officials report that D'Angelo has adapted to institutional life without incident. He follows rules, causes no trouble, and appears to have accepted his fate. He has made no attempts to appeal his conviction or sentence, perhaps understanding that the evidence against him is overwhelming and irrefutable. The communities he terrorized have rebuilt their sense of safety, though the scars of his crimes will never completely heal. Children play outside until dark again in neighborhoods that once lived in fear. Doors are left unlocked in some areas, though many residents who lived through the terror years maintain security habits learned during the decades of uncertainty. The fear that once gripped California has been replaced by the knowledge that evil, no matter how clever or patient, cannot hide forever. Science, determination, and the refusal of good people to give up can ultimately triumph over even the most carefully concealed crimes. Debbie Domingo McMullen continues her advocacy work, speaking to families facing their own long waits for justice. Now in her late 50s, she has become a respected voice in the victims' rights community, consulted by law enforcement agencies and victim service organizations across the country. Her message is always the same: never give up hope, never stop believing that truth will emerge, and never forget that love is stronger than fear. She speaks at conferences, writes articles, and mentors other families struggling with unsolved crimes. Her strength and grace in the face of tragedy have inspired countless others to persevere through their own dark times. The DNA evidence that solved the case has been preserved for future generations of forensic scientists to study. Samples from the Golden State Killer case are used in training programs for DNA analysts, genetic genealogists, and crime scene investigators. The techniques developed during the investigation continue to evolve, bringing justice to cold cases around the world. Paul Holes, who became synonymous with the case in the public mind, has transitioned to a new career as an educator and consultant. He travels the country teaching investigators about genetic genealogy, cold case investigation, and the importance of never giving up on victims. His work has helped solve dozens of additional cases and trained hundreds of investigators in cutting-edge techniques. The case has also inspired a new generation of genetic genealogists, scientists who combine expertise in genetics with genealogical research skills to help solve cold cases. These specialists work with law enforcement agencies to build family trees from DNA evidence, using public databases and traditional genealogical research to identify suspects. On quiet evenings in Goleta, when the jasmine blooms and the ocean breeze carries the scent of possibility, old-timers still remember the summer of 1981. They remember the fear that gripped their community, the uncertainty that lasted for decades, and the long wait for answers that seemed like they might never come. But mostly, they remember how their community came together in the face of tragedy, how investigators never gave up despite the longest odds, and how justice eventually prevailed over evil. They remember that love proved stronger than hate, that truth triumphed over lies, and that good people working together could achieve what seemed impossible. The Toltec Way neighborhood looks much the same as it did in 1981, with its tree-lined streets and modest homes. New families have moved into houses where others once lived in fear. Children ride bicycles and play games in front yards, their laughter echoing through streets that once knew only whispered fears and locked doors. The house where Cheri and Greg died has been renovated and sold several times over the decades. The current owners, a young family with small children, know the history of their home but have filled it with new life and new memories. They tend a garden where flowers bloom each spring, adding beauty to a place that once knew only darkness. The story of Cheri Domingo and Gregory Sanchez reminds us that every life has value, every victim deserves justice, and every family deserves closure. It proves that even when evil seems to triumph, good people working together can ensure that truth will ultimately prevail. Their legacy lives on in every cold case that gets solved, every family that finds peace, and every community that refuses to let fear have the final word. In the end, the Golden State Killer case became more than a criminal investigation. It became a testament to the power of human persistence, the march of scientific progress, and the unshakable belief that justice, though sometimes delayed, will always find a way to shine light into the darkest corners of human behavior. The nightmare that began on a summer night in 1981 finally ended with justice served and peace restored. Cheri and Greg could rest in peace, knowing that their story had helped bring about not just their own justice, but justice for countless others who had waited so long for truth to emerge from darkness. Their names are spoken with reverence at victim advocacy conferences, their story is taught in criminal justice classrooms, and their memory lives on in the hearts of those who knew them and those who worked tirelessly to bring their killer to justice. They have become symbols of hope for families still waiting for answers, proof that love endures beyond death, and that justice, though delayed, is never truly denied. The case closed, but the legacy continues. Every time genealogy solves another cold case, every time a family gets the answers they've waited decades to hear, every time justice triumphs over seemingly impossible odds, the spirits of Cheri Domingo and Gregory Sanchez are honored. Their deaths were tragic, but their story became a beacon of hope that continues to light the way for others seeking truth in the darkness.